Welcome to the Hardcore Finance Podcast with Alex and Shimon. How are you, Alex?
Good, Shimon. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very good. I have lots of thoughts about inflation on my mind today.
Yeah, there's all these news out now that the yields are going up, especially on that 10-year note, the Treasury note, which basically is a signal that inflation may be coming, and that the regular market isn't really realizing it, or now the market is awakening to it, right? And so let's discuss it. Is inflation bad? Is it good? What can it affect? And why maybe there's a contrarian thesis to inflation in general. Why, we might not see the inflation that everyone's talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would think inflation, the only good thing about inflation is that it makes your debts cheaper, right? So, like anyone who owes money, like if you have a mortgage, if you have any type of debt that has fixed interest rate, even with a variable interest rate, but let's say fixed interest rate, then inflation is good for you because your salary goes up with inflation, usually a little bit, even if it doesn't cover all of the inflation. And then the basically, if you think about it, your mortgage payment in terms of how many eggs does it take to pay your mortgage, right? So if the price of eggs goes
In
up,
real dollars or in real money.
well, that's the thing. That's why I'm using eggs to not use the term real. It's like if you think of like how many eggs do you have to devote to pay your mortgage, if the as the price of eggs goes up and your mortgage payment is fixed, you need less and less eggs to pay your mortgage payment. And so that's kind of the idea of why inflation is a very popular way to normalize debt to GDP when debt to GDP is very high, like it was after World War II. And Lynn Alden has a very good article on that. The US pretty much inflated its money supply by like 30% or something like that. And then that's how it got rid of the debt in real terms, to your point. So that's like the quote unquote good thing about inflation. The bad thing about inflation is that it really, really hurts economic growth. It hurts economic growth because it's really hard to predict the future. Like it's hard to predict what prices will be. And then people start doing irrational things. So, like, for example, if you have inflation, people will buy and hoard goods where they wouldn't do that if they knew prices would be stable. And like the hoarding of these goods basically wastes energy. Like instead of like investing my money in the stock market, I buy rice and put it like in my pantry. That's not a productive use of my money. So that's how I look at inflation and why it's bad.
Yeah, I mean, it also inflates away, or it gets rid of purchasing power, it gets rid of your wealth. And so there's a flight to safety, and you don't know what safety is. Typically, it's been gold and commodities, real estate in some ways, or counter cyclicals like energy companies. But inflation also completely destroys your ability to control and save your earnings. So you spend X amount of time and energy working, accumulating dollars or yen or euros or whatever it might be, and those dollars, the purchasing power of those dollars lose. In the U.S., inflation, a high inflation is 10%. In other countries in the developing world, a high inflation is 100% year over year. So your money is halved every single year, your purchasing power, and that's terrible. And so, yeah, look, typically
So
inflation
let
is a
me
bad thing.
click on that. No, I can I just say I want to double click on that because that's like it's a little bit more subtle than that, right? So it like your purchasing power only goes down if you store your money in cash, right? And that's the issue. So like what happens is when you have a lot of inflation, people just don't store their money in cash. Like they get their paycheck and immediately buy things with it. I heard like a fascinating analysis of like Weimar Germany when they had the hyperinflation. Literally, stock prices would go up on paydays. Like people would have like paydays on, let's say, twice a month. So like on these days, the stock market could go up because people would just like take their salary and immediately purchase shares because that was like one way to hedge against inflation. So I don't think that the idea. Yes, there's a problem of like your purchasing power going down because of people who store it in cash. But basically, at some point, people stop storing their wealth in cash, and I think basically the two biggest problems are one that it makes irrational behavior, or makes behavior that's less productive that wouldn't happen without the inflation, like hoarding like rice and goods and stuff. And also it makes you invest in risky assets because those are the only things that can protect you against inflation. And so that's what basically people have been doing for a very long time with index funds, right? You just dump all your money in index funds, and then it basically creates misallocation of capital. Like maybe you don't want to invest in Tesla. Tesla is now part of the S&P 500. Maybe you don't want to own Tesla, but guess what? You don't have any other place to put your money, so you're kind of forced to buy Tesla. Those are the kind of
Yeah,
major.
but yes, yeah, yes, and you're looking for a safe haven. Although a lot of times safe havens in Venezuela, you people buying cars and others. Typically, the U.S. dollar is a safe haven for many people. But sometimes, in periods of hyperinflation, those safe havens also disappear, and people are just rushing from some sort of hard asset to hard asset. I saw. A chart. Michael Burry actually, I think, posted this. The guy who predicted the Big Short a few days ago or 2 days ago, I believe it was him. But he talked about assets that are correlated or not correlated with inflation in terms of buying. And people buy like farmland or invest in U.S. farms or U.K. farms, and even those aren't really good stores of value. And even gold, typically thought of as an inflation hedge, can be a not so great store of value. So there's this flight, this panic, as you talked about, and irrational behavior into different hard assets. Real estate probably being the best one, but it doesn't always work out. So I think we both agree there are subtleties, but inflation generally, other than decreasing debt, isn't good. So are we heading towards inflation? Do you see inflation on the horizon in the US?
Yeah, so it's a very tricky question, and I think I have kind of a view that's shared by some, but maybe not the mainstream, which is I don't think we will get price inflation. And the reason why I don't think we'll get price inflation is because a larger and larger percent of our economy is manufactured in ways where the marginal cost of manufacturing something is very, very low. And let's explain to our listeners what marginal cost means. So there was a very good book written by, I think it was Jeremy Rifkin, The Zero Marginal Cost Economy. The idea is like there's many things where you can invest a lot of money sometimes up front, but then each individual unit of production is very cheap. So I'll give you an example. Israel had a water crisis for many years. There wasn't enough rain, and there wasn't enough water, and it was very bad. And then they built desalination plants, which sit and they basically consume electricity to take salt water and create potable water.
Mhm.
Now, those plants are super, super expensive. But somebody once had an insight. Wait a second, like the water prices that we're currently paying, the marginal cost of the water would be cheaper with desalination. So, like, yes, it's very, very expensive to build the plants, but then you only pretty much pay for the electricity to operate them. And then suddenly, Israel hasn't had any water crisis since then. And I know that we built these plants all over the world,
Mhm.
even LA. So LA had a huge drought. When LA is talking about a drought, they're not talking about potable water or like water for a shower. They're talking about agricultural water. Because like again, the prices that people are paying in LA for water that they use in their house are more expensive than it costs you to take them from the ocean. So basically, LA will never have a water shortage unless you want to grow almonds there. And then, yeah, maybe LA is not the best, like California is not the best place to grow almonds because they're extremely, water inefficient. So that's what I mean by marginal cost. It's something, or a nuclear power plant. That's another good example. Like it costs a lot of money to build it, but then once it's
Mhm.
operational, each additional megawatt, it's not very expensive. So my thesis is that our economy, you look at like Karl Marx, for example, he wrote The Capital. His whole economy was like there's a factory, there's workers, there's machines, there's land, right? And factories like the machines. So you have capital, you have people and land, and those were the factors of production. But like that's not how the economy operates today. Like Google, right? It's not very expensive for Google to generate a search result. It's not very expensive for Facebook to show an additional, feed on your timeline. So my claim is that as more and more of our economy has lower marginal costs, you can just dump money on the economy, and then people can just create more units of the same thing, and then prices will not go up with the money that's dumped in. The only thing that will go up are things that are scarce. So things that you cannot create more of. So for example, doctors, right? Doctors are scarce because like even if you had free training for a doctor, they still have to learn for many years in order to become a doctor. So the ratio of how many years they study versus how many years they work is kind of fixed, and so they're scarce no matter what. Like as long as human beings are practicing medicine and it's not robots and it's not AI, those will be scarce. So you dump money on the economy, healthcare costs will go up. But drugs, for example, not so much, right? Because drugs, you can maybe, I don't know, some AI can figure out a way to manufacture drugs. And then it's like, yeah, the drug prices will stay low. So that's my thesis, like in a very high level.
So yeah, you bring up two interesting points there. One is this deflationary pressure of technology. And so again, like you said, because the technology makes things cheaper to produce, on the margin, the next unit to produce is cheaper. Thus, it's becomes abundant. I think what's implicit in your argument is that these things become abundant. So, for example, just to extend your example, if I want a house and it takes 2 months to build a house, that's more scarce than if I want a house and somehow I can just print a house overnight and it doesn't cost a lot. Then, if we have enough land, we have enough houses. Everyone gets a house. It doesn't really matter. So inflation doesn't matter because also the need and the uh, price for that house isn't going to go up because scarcity isn't there. And so technology keeps on bringing these prices down and counteracts inflation. Now, there's two parts of the economy, or maybe three parts. Parts where technology has affected, right? Services, where it's still human capital, where you have doctors and others that are still scarce, and hard manufacturing problems where it's technology still hasn't affected those. I want to talk to you about those parts of the economy to try to figure out whether this time it's different, right? Because we definitely have an acceleration of tech. And especially in the US, we have a shift of technology from traditional manufacturing into the world of AI, digitization, and so on. But I do want to make a point before we go on. Probably 2 months ago, you and I had this conversation about the S&P versus the NASDAQ. Remember? And we both decided, hey, the NASDAQ is where we want to make a bet. This perfectly ties into that thesis, right? About what's going to capture more rents, more value pools, and it's a lot of it's new tech. Why? Because it's deflating marginal costs. It's making goods more abundant and available for people, and the industries that aren't changing are not only uncompetitive from an internal cost perspective, but also have faced an existential crisis in terms of the demand that's coming to them. Unless, again, it's a scarce commodity that holds value. So if you're making, for example, I don't know, children's toys, and a 3D printer can print this toy very cheaply versus you're putting it together by hand, it's not, you're going to be extinct, right? Because your costs, obviously, maybe this is kind of obvious, but your costs are going to be higher unless this toy is a collector's item, right? Then you can differentiate, and it becomes a scarce asset. So how do you see these sectors, right? And are we really in a this time it's different category? Because we have had this bull run, let's call it, since the Great Recession, since 2008, 2009. We've been on this massive bull run. One things that we haven't mentioned is there's been a lot of monetary easing, right? Printing of money. We've had a lot of QE. We've had a lot of why the market's going up. The Fed is printing money in order to buy bonds from the government and or buy stocks in the market. So again, stocks are going up. The government has more money to spend. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve or central banks are expanding. Typically, that lends itself to inflation later on. And so a popular view against your contrarian view is, the coronavirus is coming to an end, hopefully. There's going to be this insane demand that's going to come out in the summer, right? And people have been sitting at home and they haven't been able to spend it on anything. Now that people are going to be going out, they're going to spend on food and restaurants and consumable goods, and this pent up demand is going to flood the market. The question is that pent up demand, is that going to be driving growth, which is good, which is ultimately anti kind of inflationary because we're just growing as an economy? Or is it just going to concentrate money in a certain area where goods are scarce and those prices are going to shoot up?
So I don't think there's an either or there. So yes, it will generate growth. I think I think that's kind of consensus, right? If more people get out and do more things, it'll definitely generate growth. And yes, it will also drive up the prices of
No,
scarce
but is the
goods. The
growth
question is, are
is the
CPI, yeah,
is the growth in monetary terms? Like, hey, I can have my revenue can double because I sold my one can of soda for $2 instead of $1 because inflation went up. Or is it real growth? Like we're really expanding output, not just the price per, right? That's the thing, the nuance.
yeah, that's a very good question. So I think it's complicated, right? Because like for example, Michael Saylor had a very good point where he said inflation is a vector. It's not like one number because it really depends on what you consume, right? Like if you just consume very basic things, you do not experience inflation. And that's what the central banks mean when they say, oh, we're not able to generate inflation. We need to like, I don't know if our listeners know, but recently they raised their inflation target, not by raising it above 2%, but they said we want an average of 2%, which means if in the past 5 years it has been under 2%, that means that we can have more than 2% price inflation, um, to average 2%. But like, that's inflation for the basket of goods that not many of us want to consume. I think like food is not part of it. I know education is not part of it. Like there's some very wonky things in this basket that the central bank measures. So I
Hmm.
think there will definitely be inflation in stocks, in real estate, and all of those things that are scarce. Is your question about whether we'll see inflation in consumer prices, like the stuff that normal people consume?
Yeah, I guess it's are we gonna have real growth, right? And not just
I take
inflationary growth. So I
issue.
guess I
I take issue with the term
go ahead.
real growth. I take issue with this term. I know it's a business school and economics term. I don't think it's meaningful because real growth just means GDP growth minus inflation. And what I'm saying is inflation is a vector. It's not the same for everybody. So if you're defining real growth as again the basket that normal people consume, so the GDP growth minus the basket that normal people consume, yes, we will have real growth, I think. But if you're defining real growth as like the basket of goods that wealthy people want to consume, or upper middle class people, like if you include education, like at a top university, if you include real estate in San Francisco or
Mhm.
DC or New York, then I think the inflation there will be much much higher, and then maybe we don't get real growth for that. You realize what I'm
Yes,
saying?
okay. Let's maybe move away from. Yeah, I understand. Let's move away from the real growth versus not, because we can belabor this point, and ultimately all these CPI and this indices are kind of bullshit, right? Because like you said, they don't take into account certain key commodities or certain key spending items, which are very real in many lives. Let's talk about this whole idea of, can technology be deflationary, right? And is this time really different? Like, do we really have fundamentally different tech now that has exponentially accelerated the deflationary pressures to mitigate any kind of, I don't want to use the word real, but any kind of actual inflation worries?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an excellent. There's an excellent book by Jeff Booth called "The Price of Tomorrow," which basically talks about all the technological deflation that's happening. And yeah, I mean, I think that's my thesis. Where I'm thinking, like for example, let's take farming, right? So farming, I don't know if you know this, but like before World War II, we grew something like 50 times less produce on a piece of land. And that mainly came, the 50 times increase mainly came from very good synthetic fertilizers that we know how to produce, and like very good harvesting techniques. So you need less labor to like harvest the thing. So like the output
Mhm.
per
Mhm.
land per laborer grew like 50x, and that's food. That's like very very basic. You could say the same thing about education, right? So like education, yeah, if you want a degree from a top university, that will have a lot of inflation because it's very scarce. But if by education you mean I want to know enough skills to be able to make like an app and to get a salary of like $50,000 per year, that's extremely deflationary, right? Like 10 years ago, it was very, very hard to get this knowledge. Now it's like trivial, it's free. You can start like making apps and selling your skills online. So that's what I'm saying. It's like, I think it's getting into more and more areas of the economy. And that's what makes me very optimistic, because otherwise, with all this money printing, we would be very screwed. Like, I just want to be very explicit for our listeners. The big worry about inflation is that once you see CPI inflation, like once the prices of things that people actually consume start going up, the government has to raise interest rates in order to lower the prices, in order to like, take some steam off the economy. Once you
Mhm.
raise the interest rates, it becomes really, really hard to service your debt. So that was like the stagflation that happened in the 70s. It was stagnation plus inflation. And many people say that wasn't a problem of money printing. That was all a result of the oil embargo of the Arab countries. Like in the 70s, they just stopped selling oil to the US. And so then the price of oil went up. And energy is a huge component in the price of manufacturing everything. So some people claim that the reason why prices went up in the 70s is not just because of the money printing, but it's because there was money printing and there wasn't the technology to generate enough energy. But I would say now we have this technology. I mean, look at fracking, right?
Yeah. So, but even outside of fracking, there are other methods of producing energy. You mentioned nuclear before. Renewables are now fundamentally on a unit cost basis cheaper than than your coal. Coal is going away. Natural gas is here. So, I mean, the point is that your unit input cost for electricity is becoming cheaper and cheaper. And so let's actually, I want to take it here, right? So you and I talked a little bit before the episode and over the course of a couple of days. Let's project into the future because we don't really know what's going to happen this time around. You can make the same argument that, during 1920s and 30s, their technology was better than 100 years ago. And typically these cycles go about 80 to 100 years, right? These are kind of big macro mega cycles of, of this expansion, kind of crash, right? Deflation, and then, expansion again, and so on and so forth. So let's think in the future. Let's we had an episode with Stefan Rivera about Austrian versus Keynesian school, and we talked about, you brought up a good point, and you said, hey, look, if there's infinite amount of resources, right, or said other ways, resources are cheap, are free, input electricity on the marginal cost, then it doesn't matter how much money you print, because you will have less and less competition for a certain good, because that good is going to be free. So for example, if you know before you would pay $5 for a grain of sand, and now everyone has beaches and you can just go out and get sand, there's going to be no inflation no matter how much money you or I have, whether it's $5 or $5 million, because all the stuff is free. We can just go get these grains of sand, right? And so there's probably a world where we're going to have such advanced technology where basic levels of kind of life, your housing, your food, shelter, medicine, ability to kind of thrive, are going to be so cheap that it doesn't matter which, if you're under the Austrian method or Keynesian method, if you're printing money, it's not going to matter for we won't have a level of inflation that's going to hit these goods. Now it's going to be different for investment assets, right? And I think that's going to drive, we talked about this, income inequality, right? Or at least a divide between the haves and have nots, in terms of the haves will take this money and put it into investment income because they'll have more of it, legacy assets, generational passed down assets. Have nots won't. And so, the haves of money will multiply a lot faster. The have-nots won't, but their life status and their life quality of life will be much higher and than it is now. They won't have disease. They'll be able to be fed. They'll have great houses. They'll have great access to technology. They just maybe won't be able to live on Mars like the haves of, I don't know, 2380.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly where we're headed, by the way. And yeah, it's funny that there's many dystopian futures, right? We spoke about this last time, where in many dystopian Hollywood movies, they show, for example, the movie Elysian, or the movie, uh, was it Snowpiercer, where in Elysian you have this like space station that has amazing healthcare, and then like people on Earth have like shitty healthcare, and only if you become like really really good, you get like to ride up to the spaceship and like cure your disease.
Yeah.
Like, that's Hollywood drama. But what if like the people on the spaceship had like amazing healthcare, but the people on Earth had like just good enough healthcare to live to till they're 200, like pain free with like no diseases, and let's say the people on the spaceship live to be 1,000, also pain free with no diseases, then it becomes less of a problem, no? Like, I'm a big believer in like looking at the quality of life of the poor people, and and judging the society by that. I remember in when I was like a young kid in Bulgaria, it was a communist country, only one channel, right? Like only one news station. It was always
Mhm.
like all the socialist countries, it's like a worker's paradise, people like relaxing, playing cards, and then they would show like New York, like Manhattan, they would show like homeless people all the time, or they would show like riots and strikes and like racial inequality, and that is true. But like, they just didn't show one thing, that the bottom 10% of the population in Manhattan live much better than the bottom 10% in the USSR. That part they didn't show, but they showed like actual, you
Or the middle.
or the middle, of course, yeah, like the median.
Or the middle. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah. That's very true. That's very true because yeah, you have no context. So, I always go back and forth on this idea because in principle, I think this idea works, but it's a little bit kind of like Marxist to me in a way that it works ideally, but maybe in practice it doesn't, because everything for humans is a matter of context. And so if you believe, based on today's, like, if you said to me, "Hey, would you like to live until 90 and you will get sick sometimes, but we have antibiotics, or would you like to live until you're 200 pain free and you go out and you have this peaceful death?" Right? I would say, of course I want the other one, because it sounds very utopian to me right now. But now, if you shift me to 200 years from now, and I have my choices, and I'll live to 200 or live to 1,000, now I'm like, wait a second, how come they get to have 1,000 and I only get to have 200? Right? And so I think things always shift. And even though, because we can make the same argument going backwards, the lowest 10 or 20% of our society now live much, much, much better than, let's say, the top of society lived 2,000 years ago. Much better, right? There's no disease, we have antibiotics, there's no wars, nobody's coming in and brutally cutting you with a sword just to have a little piece of your land, right? No, in most countries. And so I think
You go to
things,
the dentist, you have anesthesia.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Nobody's
You
cutting
go to the dentist.
nobody's pulling your teeth out without anesthesia. Um, women have rights and so on and so forth. So eh, I think things always shift. Now, I think there's something to the idea that technology, because it's an exponential good, if you will, or an exponential move, the changes between 2,000 years ago and now, that same rate of change is probably, 100 years from now to, I don't know, 21, 21, right? And so on and so forth, because it's an exponential change. And the delta between 21, 21, between now and 21, 21 is going to be like the delta between 21, 21 and 21, 50. It's going to get shorter and shorter in terms of big technological progresses. And I don't think we're there yet, but I do believe that we'll be in a place where we won't necessarily need to worry about printing money, and wealth will be completely thought about differently. And maybe wealth will come back about your time to do different activities, or it's going to be more about time and not necessarily about a money or a store of value. Maybe wealth will be completely redefined because a store of value will be a foregone or antiquated metric KPI of wealth.
Yeah, and I totally could see that, and yeah, I mean, wealth could start being redefined. I'm just like worried. So I was very optimistic until now, but I have one thing that worries me, which means back to what we mentioned about like misallocation of resources. So because like even if the energy is free, and even if like you can get a bunch of stuff for free, like let's just think about it. Let's say the pharma industry, right? It's very lucrative and very good because it develops drugs that people then consume, and it lengthens their life, let's say. But then if the government can print a lot of money and can offer people like
Mhm.
really high salaries to work in things that are not productive, like government jobs, like certain government jobs, like then it basically takes people away from industries that are more productive. And that I think we're very far from solving. Because I think like it's one thing to consume like things that we already know how to produce. It's very easy to like drop their marginal cost. But what about discovering new things? Right? What about research? What about like all of these things that we still don't know how to produce? There's
Yeah.
no efficient way to allocate people there except through capitalism. And the problem with printing money is then it kind of like distorts the market signals. And like, yeah, the government will because like people on the left now, for example, they say, oh, like we should have free childcare for everybody. It's like, okay, great, but who's going to provide the free childcare, right? Like imagine if people say now, oh, childcare is such a problem. It's like, okay, great. What level of childcare do you want? It's like, oh, I want 7 days a week, 8 hours per day in an amazing facility. Okay, great. Let's say now that the government could print money and give this money like to provide this service. Who's going to work there, right? They're doing something else right now. So like is providing free childcare the best thing they could be doing with their time? Or maybe they should research how to create new drugs. That's the biggest problem with money printing. And I don't think we have a good solution for that.
Yeah, I'm actually less worried about that because I hear you and I think you're right. But there's two assumptions there. One is that human labor will be scarce, and I'm not sure that that's going to be true in the long run. Maybe AI is going to take over and it's going to be very, very cheap to do all of this. You'll have some sort of robot or AI humanoid caring for the baby, let's say. I think the second thing is I actually think at least the US government. The US government historically has been very good about pushing new technologies. A lot of the new tech, the internet came from the government. A lot of new tech was originated and started by the government. The CIA has private. It's called InQtel. So the CIA has private, like it's a VC arm that invests in completely new tech. And there's a lot of this is the whole Cold War, Russians stealing from the U.S. and the U.S. stealing from the Soviet Union, state secrets. And in many ways, the Cold War fostered a ton of innovation, right? A ton of innovation, getting to space, with the weapons race. And again, the weapons race, we talked about this. Nuclear weapons have ironically, made us more safe because we're not fighting these bloody wars or else we're going to destroy each other. So it creates extreme moral hazard, right? And so I actually think, on a micro level, yeah, allocating babysitting jobs, in this case, or nanny jobs, may not be the best use of someone's time, but maybe it is. Maybe it frees up the person that it's like this trickle down kind of economy. Maybe it frees up the parent to do the thinking. It's all about, can you allocate the best comparative advantage of labor to the best position. So let's say right now so there's I guess three theses. One, you can have AI that obfuscates human labor. Two is that you can perfectly allocate comparative advantage. Let's say the person now is working as a chef and he's not a very good chef, but he's an incredible teacher, an incredible baby, like a nanny, a child caregiver. So you incentivize him to quit his chef job, move over to take care of the kid, and maybe the stay-at-home parent the mom, let's say, is an incredible chef, but she's now forced on, staying home with the kid because it's not affordable. Maybe she goes out and becomes a chef, right? And so you have a shift in comparative advantage. And I think three is that for really kind of high growth, true state of the art technology, I don't think there's been I don't know. I'm kind of going on a limb here, but I would love to know a technology that's been developed that's been truly global, revolutionary, world changing, that has not been in some way assisted by or created by the government. I don't know of one. Even the rumors, there are these crazy rumors that the blockchain and Bitcoin was created by the CIA to help fund terrorist activities. Now, I think that's a little bit of a conspiracy theory, but the government always fosters innovation, like really, really fosters innovation.
Yeah, that's really beyond my area of understanding. I've heard debates on both sides, and I really don't know who's right. But I think you raise a very interesting point that goes against the Austrian economics, which is like people say, if we give people money, they will not have an incentive to be productive. And then what the Keynesians say is exactly what you said, is like, no, if you give them money, they will actually be able to focus on what they're best at, right? So that they would do, instead of like someone who's an amazing chef that cannot like do it because like she has to take care of their kids, now she can do it. So like I don't know who's right. I lean towards agreeing with you. But yeah, I just think that basically the more prosperity we have, the more the lower the cost of manufacturing things, the more surplus we have to invest in the things that really matter. And I don't really care if the government does it or if the private sector does it. The important thing is to have enough surplus and enough like wealth to be able to invest in those like
Mhm.
new things.
You know what's very interesting? I was listening to Chamath Palihapitiya talk. He's running for the governor of California as obviously a big VC, and he talked about one thing that was very, very critical. And he said his political beliefs and his outlook on growth and the economy has been very much shaped by his upbringing in Canada. And he said, look, we had enough welfare. So you can go to college, for free, and you had free medicine and so on. Basically, it created a safety net for you to be able to take risks because you knew that if you faltered, there's a safety net to catch you. And I think this, the true kind of capitalist system is no safety net, because when you're out there and your back is against the wall, you're going to succeed, right? That's one. The second one is, hey, there's a safety net, so you go ahead, take risks, because if you fall, there's something there to catch you. And I don't know which one is best. It really depends on how you're motivated. It's kind of like coaching a sport. There's some coaches that get in your face and yell at you, and some coaches are more about
Mhm.
coaching you and treating you more like a family, like father son or mother daughter kind of uh, relationship. And it's different for different people. There is something to be said about having a safety net to be able to take risks. And we saw this. I'll just make one last point, and I want to hear your opinion here. We saw this fundamentally with, and this is one of the things that I love about Obamacare, actually, is that people, I don't know if you remember, before Obamacare, wouldn't switch jobs, and you were stuck in a certain employment position because your healthcare was provided by your employer. And so people who were wanting to get out and start businesses, especially start your own business, right? Healthcare was a major deterrent to go and start your own business. Now that you had Obamacare, you can buy insurance on an open market, and it didn't cost you an arm or a leg, because before Obamacare, pre-existing conditions and so on cost a lot. People started, like, we should look at if there's a statistic, but after Obamacare, the velocity of job switching spiked. uh, and it's all about, now you have a safety net. You don't need to worry about this fundamental Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you have. So go out and take a risk. Try to build something. The risk, it becomes a lot more de-risked for you to become an entrepreneur.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, I could tell you the flip side of this is like if you gave, let's say, imagine a society where you gave everybody $100,000 per year, like just universal basic income. I don't know if people would be less motivated to do work, and that's why I'm thinking it's like it's not like a zero or a one. It's probably like somewhere in between.
Exactly.
Like you have to give people enough of safety net so they can like fail and still be okay, but not too much of a safety net so they just like stay and play video games all day at home. So I don't know what's the right amount. I would just say that with Bitcoin, it's the first time that we can actually test this, because like Bitcoin for the first time allows you to opt out of the system, right? And it's very easy for like some jurisdiction to say, look, here's an insurance plan that basically pays your kids like a safety. It includes a safety net for your kids. So deposit 10 Bitcoin into this account, right? And then like if your kids ever fall on hard times, they can get like this safety net. But like it's not something that you tax other people to provide. And I think that's like the future. I think it's much better when these things are provided on a local level than when they're provided on a federal kind
Mhm.
of global level, because then people feel more, less entitled to it. It's even called entitlements. Like it's such a stupid name, entitlements, because like no, it's like you pay into it and then you get some of it back. And yes, some people pay into it less than they get back. Others pay more than they get back, but it's not an entitlement. It's just like some sort of like savings plan.
It's
And I think,
insurance.
yeah, it's insurance, exactly. And so that's like a huge innovation, where if you can really opt out of the system, it will many different models will proliferate, and we'll be able to measure and see what is the most effective thing. Because like as we spoke in the episode with Stefan, many of these macroeconomic things you cannot A B test them. Like you can't split a country in half, make sure that each half has the same people in terms of their education, in terms of their productivity, and then like give a safety net to half, and then the other half don't get a safety net, but they get lower taxes. You can't really do this experiment. And even within states, I've heard criticisms that it's like, as long as you can move from state to state, right, you can just like, if the state of California has like some really good benefits, people will move to California. Like the least productive people will move to California to get the benefits, and so the system becomes bankrupt. So it's a very
Mhm.
tricky business, right? And I'm even thinking like, why do we have like? I think a big problem is that we have to treat everybody the same, because it's like democracy and they vote. So anything that passes in Congress has to apply equally to everybody. But I think that's actually a big, it's a problem, right? Because it doesn't allow you um, to make interesting policies, right? Like if you have to treat everybody the same, it just like creates, I mean, my state example is a problem, right? Like if you give a safety net in one state, and then the other problem is like countries now, they control this through immigration. So they basically say, here's an imaginary line. Everybody who lives within this line is entitled to the benefits. Everybody who lives outside of the line is not. But like with the internet and with Bitcoin and with all of these things, the geography becomes much less important, and then it will be very hard for countries to like keep this system going. I think they'll have to innovate. I think they'll have to come up with something else. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so there's you brought up a couple of things. I want to rewind for a second. I I actually disagree very much with the universal basic income because of exactly what you said. Because people will not be incentivized if you just give them a whole lot of money. I don't believe they'll be incentivized to do as a whole, as a group, incentivized to go out and innovate. Some will, others will just choose to be lazy, because I think for people the path of least resistance is to not do versus to try and do and conquer. We've seen this through communism. The flip side to that is you give some sort of, you pick, the government picks and chooses which welfare programs, which safety nets they invest in. So let's say food, shelter, and medicine and education, right? Let's say those are the safety nets for a person. Um, but the what that causes is inflation in those sectors, just like we saw inflation in education in the U.S. That's a huge irony, right? You either pick and choose, or you give money to everyone, but the money to everyone is not going to incentivize good behavior, I don't think. But if you pick and choose, you're going to cause you're going to concentrate on inflation. I think the other the your question, I also don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. I agree that you can't A/B test, and I do agree that Bitcoin provides us with the first way to really kind of test this. Um, but I guess we'll see, right? We'll see if the self selection bias, the self selection problem, like you said in California, why does California have a whole bunch of homeless people? Because it provides great benefits to the poor, and so a lot of homeless people literally travel to get to California, and so it creates this crazy self selection bias. And the same thing, and this is why insurance, either everyone has to have it or no one has to have it, because it'll create a self selection of the very risk prone in medicine or whatever the insurance is for are going to buy the policy, and the people who are not won't. So I don't know. We'll see. I think we'll see with Bitcoin. I think it's very hard to predict what exactly is going to happen or how human behavior will shake out.
Yeah, and I think in general we're becoming better and better at this. Like I think if once like you study about progressive taxes versus regressive taxes, and the ancient empires, it was you basically tax per skull. It was called, so no matter who you are, you pay the same amount, and that's like the worst. Then you have like in the U.S. in the beginning when the country was just founded, there was no federal income tax. Most of the taxes for the federal government
Mhm.
were created by tariffs. So then it's like a little bit more progressive, but it's still stuff that everybody consumes, and so everybody pays kind of as they consume things. And now we're taxing income, which I think is extremely inefficient. That's like I think we went too far to one side, but we don't tax assets as much in terms of capital gains, and I think that's very smart because like the US understands we want investment, and the way to increase investment is to make people invest. How do you make people invest? By not taxing their investments. And so I think that's kind of genius. So, for example, in Israel, you have this. I don't know, the real estate lobby is just like super strong there. So there's no tax if you rent out your apartment, it's not considered capital gains. But if you invest in the stock market, it is considered
Really?
capital gains.
Mm.
And so, yeah, so basically everybody has like three apartments, and like nobody pays off their mortgage. They keep refinancing their mortgage and using that money to put a down payment on another apartment. And so it's like, okay, but then, it makes real estate very, very unaffordable. Like real estate prices in Israel are maybe 30 or 40% cheaper than San Francisco, but the salary is like half. It's a big problem. Like I'm talking about Tel Aviv, like the big city where everybody wants to live. So like you don't want to do that. Like you don't want to distort sectors. Or to your point about education, right? Like people say, let's guarantee student loans with a federal guarantee. Oh, suddenly the price of tuition went up by a lot. So I think the government has to be very careful with what they do with the money they print. We spoke about that. Remember, it's like the episode we did about leverage. It's the same thing. Like the government printing money
Mhm.
is basically leverage against their future tax income. They're saying like, we'll make this income in the future, but we'll spend it now. So like, yeah, if you spend it on good things, then it's good for the economy. If you spend it on bad things, it's bad for the economy. What I'm worried about is that, again, because we live in a democracy, you get like many special interest groups pushing for spending the money on things that are not necessarily the most efficient, and that's what worries me. And that's why I think we kind of, as we wrap up the episode, I really want to bring it back to investments and to like, how do we make money? Like let's say we agree with our general paradigm that we mentioned here, which is like, A, technology is deflationary, B, marginal costs will become cheaper and cheaper. We didn't even talk about 3D printing. There's tons of technology. Like people they should read Jeff Booth's book, because he goes sector by sector and shows how deflationary technology is. But okay, so we know that the marginal costs are dropping, and we know that the government's going to print a lot of money and do something with this money. We don't know exactly what. With the Biden administration, we have some idea, but that's very short term. Who will come after Biden, right? Like we don't know. So, what do you think is the best way to position somebody's investments? A, to protect one's money from the money printing, because clearly, if you keep it in cash, it's a very bad idea. And B, are there any sectors that are more interesting to you?
Yeah, I wrestle with this every day because, as you and I know, we manage money for a select group of individuals, and uh, we think about this all the time. well, there's kind of these consensus views of going when there's inflation going into commodities. I think both you and I are very big on, or at least are making a fairly big all-in bet, if you will, on Bitcoin being the winning commodity that's anti-inflationary. And also, by the way, should perform well when the economy is booming. It's just when you have this reflationary period, or when interest rates are the yields of the 10-year bonds and the long-term yields are increasing, that's where Bitcoin really is at a disadvantage, because it's considered still kind of a growth. It moves still very well with kind of growth assets. You know, I think until Bitcoin becomes a more unified standard, I don't see a better, theoretically, I don't see a better investment than Bitcoin, because not only is it anti inflationary, but it's also a great store of value, right? It's property. Now, real estate is not a good one, but real estate, again, if there's deflationary pressures and it's easier to build houses, right? Then the home prices should fall regardless. No amount of new technology will make it easier to mint Bitcoin. That's the beauty, I think, of Bitcoin, right? But new technology can make it easier to find and mine gold and silver and copper and all these other metals. So in the long run, nothing in the next 50, 100, 150 years is going to come around that's going to make Bitcoin mining easier, just by the natural software that Bitcoin is written on. So look, I think Bitcoin, we're both all in on Bitcoin. Now it can come back and burn us. I mean, I'm always worried about thinking about, if it seems too good to be true, is there an unknown that we haven't thought through? Maybe there is, right? Maybe there is, but definitely not cash, right? It's like the market, the stock market. I think we both have a pretty good position in the market in tech stocks, because the tech stocks, like we talked about, are going to take over the long run a lion's share of the growth naturally, because they're the ones that are pushing these deflationary pressures, right? The they're the guardians keeping this runaway economy from happening. So I think, as we're talking through this, I'm kind of solidifying the thesis in my head, honestly. I think in the long run, all things being equal, we should be in tech and in Bitcoin. One, it should take a lot of the rent and the value from this deflationary push against inflation, and the other, you literally cannot make cheaper, versus everything else you can make cheaper in the world. Everything else, unless it's a collector's item, and those are typically fads, right? Maybe like Leonardo da Vinci's art isn't a fad. Buy paintings, buy masterpiece paintings, although that value can go up and down just based on what society values, right? Or some sort of store value, monetary store value, that you cannot make cheaper with better technology at the margin, and that's Bitcoin. That's the only thing that's out there. What do you think?
Well, I think you raised a super interesting point that I haven't thought about before, which is like, how do you invest in things that cannot be made for cheaper? And this is a little bit of counterintuitive to me, because if you think of like tech companies, right? The standard not criticism, but the standard thing is like, oh, what? Like tech companies, like the iPhone gets cheaper and cheaper every year, but like Apple is still a very valuable company. Or like they say about Facebook, right? Like the cost of like storing something in the cloud is cheaper and cheaper, and that's what allowed Facebook to do the mobile stuff, and that's what allowed Facebook to like give you lots of stuff that MySpace didn't give. But I'm thinking about all the valuable companies at the end of the day boil down to something that's finite. So I just had this insight. The reason why Facebook is valuable is because it relies on the experiences of all the people that are uploading their content to Facebook, and that's like a finite resource. Like the people taking the pictures, the people writing the posts, it's like their own
Mhm.
individual experiences. That's a final thing. There's only a limited amount of posts that you can do per day. Same thing with Google. Like I was just thinking, why is Google so valuable? They index the whole internet, but who writes the internet? It's people who write the internet, right? It's like people who make websites. They invest their time, their finite time in it, and Google just organizes them and makes them more accessible. So I think that this is a great lens to think through when you think about investments, right? It's like, can you make something cheaper? And if so,
Mhm.
maybe that's not a good thing to invest in. Now, what's really cool is that also helps me understand why I really love investing in indexes and not picking companies, because like a Tesla.
Because you don't know.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. A Tesla, like, I don't know, maybe like 20 years from now, we'll have 10 companies that are all like Tesla. And yeah, now Tesla has an advantage. But like, will they keep their advantage in 10 years? I don't know. Like Carnegie with its steel was like amazing. That was a tech company. But now the steel is made in China and it's a commodity. So this cycle of like commodities becoming cheaper and cheaper, it's a very big thing I believe in. I think Bitcoin is genius in the fact that, just like you said, it's like no matter what happens, you can't make more of it. Real estate, by the way, the biggest problem of real estate is that you can build more. Like that's the absolute biggest problem. It's like whenever something becomes,
Land, but land. So
yeah, so the
yeah,
land is
sorry.
fine,
There's a
but
little
like
bit of
you can build higher buildings, or you can have self-driving cars and expand. You can expand like vertically, you can expand horizontally.
mm, yeah. Uh, as we're talking through this, I know we were starting to wrap, but this is actually an interesting point. For sure, Bitcoin, because you cannot make it cheaper. I do think that Facebook and Tesla are different than US Steel, because US Steel was making a good, right? Facebook and Google and all these guys are capturing a finite resource, which is mind share. There's only 20, that's time. They're really capturing time. And there's only 20, no matter what we do, there are 24 hours in a day for a human. Now, interestingly, right? The longer we live, the less valuable Facebook and Google and all these guys become, because we now have more time, right? That's an interesting insight. I know we're kind of doing this on the fly, but this is a really key insight. The longer we live, the less valuable these companies become, even though you can monetize us over a certain period of time. Natural human attention spans shift. The one counter argument to that is these guys have network effects, massive, massive network effects. And so it's kind of like, once you switch, if there's a switch from, let's say, a Snapchat to a Clubhouse, once the switch that's happening, then the other one really goes away. There's no more value. It just becomes a commodity attention grab, right? This is why you have this in, this is why, for example, in the Netflix wars and the streaming wars, Netflix versus Hulu versus Prime versus HBO, these guys are just, they're just racing out and producing content. So as long as you produce content, you're okay. But as soon as you stop, you lose attention for a second. You're a dry cleaner. You can go here or you can go watch there. So you're in this rat race for mind share, right? And so in the long run, actually, these, now that I'm thinking about it, I need to deleverage my position from these guys, because for the next maybe 5 or 6 years they'll be good, but in the long run, it's something else to come. It's very hard to do that to Google. It's very hard to do that to Facebook. Although Facebook, as we see, is now losing share because people are losing interest in it. So even these guys, they don't have they have to keep on reinventing themselves on how to capture time. Bitcoin is really the only technological asset or solution now that cannot get cheaper with advancements of tech. And even Google and Facebook, the longer you live and the more you go through life, they're good for finite 10-year periods of someone's time, and then something else comes along. And I do think that Facebook in the long run will it's not going to sustain its position in the long run. Something else is going to come up and become better, and so on and so forth. Actually, this is very interesting. It's going to be very
Yeah,
hard to unseat Bitcoin. It's going to be very hard to unseat Bitcoin because of exactly this.
yeah, and to your point about the scarcity of like time and everything, I think that that's a really key point. Like when people talk about network effects, the network effect only exists if it's about something scarce. Like if you think about it, Google, right? Why is Google so valuable? It's because there's basically an infinite or lots of like information on the web, and you don't have infinite time to sift through all of it. So you need like someone to like condense the most important information, right, and display it to you. And that's very, very kind of powerful because once you've indexed all the sites, it's really hard for somebody else to do that. But what if we have an AI that can just generate content on the fly? Just think about Siri that can like take it's
Mhm.
like a Google thing where it takes like everything from the internet, synthesizes it, but it also generates a little bit of extra information, and then gives you the answer. I would say if
Google is no longer valuable.
exactly, Google is no longer valuable unless Google does it. But then my point is, when you invest in Google, there's two things: you're buying their network effect. You're also buying like the brains of the people who work there. So there's a little bit of a dual thing there, where it's like, that's why people say about Tesla, it's like worth more than all the car companies combined. It's like, yeah, but like, do all the other car companies have people that are as good as the Tesla engineers? Not really. So it's like you're buying
Mhm.
power of Tesla to build new things. But my point is, that's why I'm like, index is very good, because like it's a natural cycle through. Like, some people enter the index, so some companies enter the index, some companies leave the index. And so that's why I love index funds. I mean, for example, Tesla now is part of the S&P 500, right? So it's amazing. So I didn't have to choose like to invest in Tesla. By holding the S&P 500, I get exposure to Tesla. Bitcoin, that's another cool thing, right? Bitcoin will enter into more and more balance sheets of
Mhm.
companies. We saw this now. Tesla announced, MicroStrategy is just leveraging more and more. And so then by holding the index, at some point you'll get exposure to Bitcoin, even if you don't buy Bitcoin. Coinbase now is going to IPO for a huge valuation. Again, will be part of an index. It's great. So that's why I think the index funds are genius in terms of the ability to expose capital to like whatever's the most kind of profitable way to deploy it right now. I still think, for example, biotech is can be a hugely like profitable thing. I just don't know when is the right time, because it's been a sector that until COVID it kind of underperformed. Now maybe it will be like a new renaissance of the whole biotech space, but maybe we're still too early.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very interesting lens of like, invest in things where you cannot make more, very easily more out of that thing, and you'll probably be okay.
I think we should. Well, let's let this gestate a little bit. We should do an episode on this in the future. But there is something, because I'm just thinking on the fly. There is nothing really kind of like Bitcoin where it truly cannot be made cheaper as time goes on, and everything else can be broken, other than you, like I said, network effects and brains. And that's a like I know we're kind of doing this and we just came to it. I think we need to gestate this and synthesize it a little bit more for our listeners. It's a very, very interesting lens to look at things. Like, as new companies come in, are they essentially solving a problem where technology cannot essentially deflate it away, right? Is it truly fighting for a scarce piece of the market? And the more scarce of a TAM it's going after, right, the better of a long-term valuation this is.
I don't. What do you mean by the more scarce of a TAM? That's the one part I didn't understand. TAM is total addressable market.
Yeah, so the total addressable market of Facebook and Google is attention, right? Attention's fairly scarce unless we live longer and we move, right? So versus and it's attention coupled with network effects versus, for example, uh, any auto company, right? Forget Tesla for a second. They sell you a car that's nice for 5 years, and then you get a new car, and then you can switch very easily. So you have to keep on manufacturing. You're in a rat race, right? You're in a complete rat race, and ultimately, this is why margins on cars equal like a BMW and a Benz. What's the difference? Some preference, right? There's brand, there's a value to the brand, but that's really it. One drives, the other drives. They're both luxurious. They're all great. What's the difference between a Honda and a Nissan and a Toyota? They're all pretty much the same in the same level, right? Because there are no network effects. That's why Tesla is good, because the network effects and the way Elon built it. This is actually the genius of Tesla, because Tesla's self-driving cars. Not only there's the electric vehicles, batteries, but their self-driving cars rely on a network of drivers. It learns from the network. Everyone else self-driving cars use lidar, which is they map out what's in front of you. So it's very input output kind of based manufacturing process, which is just a new way to manufacture old things better. Elon has created network effects, brought network effects to his production. Similar with Google and Facebook and so on. Like Google is in a much better long term position to me than Facebook because again, like I said, Google is indexing, and the more and more you get, it's very hard someone to catch up to Google. It's going to be you can catch up to Facebook as long as you create something that's that snaps that inertia, that attention span inertia. Bitcoin is going to be very hard to break, because you can't cheapen it away, right? You can't obfuscate Bitcoin. So as long as a coin like Bitcoin comes up with network effects, it could have been called Shimon and Alex coin, but Bitcoin came first. It was called Bitcoin. Now that it's out of the gate, it's impossible to catch it, and you can't make it cheaper. So again, the TAM has to be, the market has to be something that is that has network effects and that you cannot deflate away.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's a very interesting way of looking at it. I've never thought of that the total addressable market should be something that is kind of scarce. You should be addressing something that's scarce. Because otherwise, yeah, the margins will be inflated away. And yeah, that's the main reason why I don't like real estate, because I know that real estate is great, if you pick the right time to invest and if you pick the right city to invest. But essentially, there's nothing preventing more of it to be created. Like, and I think if long term, for example, people pay 30% of their salary to living costs, whatever. So, okay, now San Francisco is super expensive because the IPOs that happened now, Airbnb IPO'd and Uber IPO'd and Lyft IPO'd. And so there's many people with lots of money. But guess what? Like, new startups now are thinking twice. Should I start in San Francisco? Because like I'll have to pay people, to rent an apartment, and their neighbor will be someone that IPO'd through Airbnb. So I, as a young startup, have to fund the living costs of someone competing with Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's not, and then the startups will go and start in Austin, right, or some other place where they can do it. So that's a very good
Yeah,
way of thinking
exactly.
about it. Like, go after a market that's kind of scarce and fixed, and not more of it can be created. Unfortunately, like, it's very hard to come up with a product like this, but it's easy to come up with an index, right? So like S&P 500, very, very scarce. Just think about it. Like, what are the odds of you being able to recreate the S&P 500 in another
True.
country, or it's
That's
very
true.
hard, right? And it already sits in all the 401ks, and it has all the inflow of capital already going in it. Same with Nasdaq, right? So yeah, we'll think about it some more, and I bet we'll reference this episode in the future. Like, one of the favorite things, two things that I really
Many
love about this podcast. One is that we're time stamping our predictions, and then we can go back and see how right we were. And two, how like there's these themes that come through. Sometimes we'll reference an episode from like 10 weeks ago. So yeah, very happy about that.
Well, yeah, look, we'll definitely have to come back to it. So, for our listeners, thank you for listening. Hardcorefinance.com. Like us, subscribe, leave us comments, send us feedback. Shout out to Melissa, who's emailed us, and others. So, please, yeah, just keep it coming. We love hearing from you. And we'll talk to you next time, Shimon.
Yeah, talk to you next time, Alex. This was a pleasure as always.
Pleasure as always.